So, all right, I'll give you an example. I recently met with the Mormon missionaries. We had 5 or 6 weeks together, and I assume they come in. I assume that they're not consciously trying to deceive me. They've bought into, they've been deceived themselves, like you said.
Right.
They're not consciously trying to. So I want to understand what they're really ultimately saying, and I want to share with them ultimately how what I follow and what I've committed to is different. And so we just spent ask a lot of questions. I just spent a lot of time asking them, because I realized that, first of all, you don't really know what any Latter-day Saint believes until they tell you. So in fact, one of these missionaries had some idiosyncratic views. I said, well, that's really different from when I grew up in Mormonism, so let's talk about that. And he had some things that were kind of within the broad parameters of Mormon thinking, but they were unique to him a little bit. And I hadn't heard like those things necessarily.
Well, like what, for example, do you remember?
Well, he believed, this is really interesting. It's an interesting conversation we had on this. He believes that God was not once a man.
Okay, I've heard this on the streets in Provo many different times.
Yeah, he believes that God was always God, that he is, but all the rest about Mormonism, the Mormon idea of God, he believes that. He believes that we could become gods. So God was not a unique being in the sense that other than he always existed as God and he did not become God. And that's how we're different in their thinking, that we did not always exist as God, but we could become God by following the ordinances and so forth.
Doesn't that undermine the doctrine of exaltation and eternal progression, though?
I mean, you would think.
Yeah, you'd think it would. You'd think it would. We talked about that. So what he's trying to maintain is that this critique of Mormonism, biblical critique of Mormonism, is that God's a contingent being, and that if God was not always God, then maybe God never lived a mortal life, or you guys interviewed Aaron Shavaloff recently. Maybe God never sinned,
right?
Because he didn't have a mortal life, and so forth. So they're trying to preserve a certain dignity or a certain ontological quality for God, yet they still want to maintain the whole thing about eternal progression, so they apply it to the rest of us. In a way, it was creative.
So what did you think about Jesus then?
I think he accepted pretty much. It seemed like the traditional LDS perspective on Jesus.
Interesting.
That Jesus did have to become God.
Man, see, that's where it all starts falling apart, because then Jesus is still not the eternal God. There can be only one God to them, who is the Father, that they worship through Jesus Christ, which is odd.